Well, we're all still learning. I think at the end of the pandemic, everybody's going to be able to produce a TV show. So,
I know. You know,
all right, we are now live. I see us. Very cool. Wait a couple moments here. A couple viewers. That's nice.
It's Friday night.
It is Friday night.
But that's Friday nights are for sitting around a fire and talking, chewing the fat.
I'm down for that, especially in this era where everything seems so politicized and we're probably zoomed out.
Well, you know, I realize that I have a hard time talking on the phone now because I can't see the visual cues. Literally now, I spend so much time in Zoom meetings. I need the physical visual cues when people are stopping. When they're not going to talk, they're not going to continue to talk.
Right. I feel that. I've been FaceTiming more and Zooming with friends more, and it's just good to see each other. I mean, I realized it's been 7 months since I've seen my closest friends, that we were in the same space together. And recently we went to a rally for Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm like, I'm crying because it's like, I haven't seen you. I haven't felt your energy. I haven't been with my people in a while because of the pandemic. So,
well, I think our descendants will say, oh, back in the 21st century, it's a time when Indians were all over the internet. Man, all they wanted to do was Zoom.
it's true. It's very true. Well, why don't we get started? We got a few viewers here, and I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you. My name is Prairie Rose Seminole. I'm with Advanced Native Political Leadership. We are a brand new organization dedicated to building Native power and raising more candidates, organizers, and strategists across the country. And I'm being joined today with Judith Leblanc from the Native Organizers Alliance. And we are happy to have a conversation around 2020 and the election and what's happening across Indian country with the Native vote and the organizations building power and organizing in our own communities. So welcome, Judith. Let's hear more about you. What is Native Organizers Alliance, and who have come from this space and where you're holding it now?
So, Prairie Rose, it's great to have this conversation. I think that a lot of times our paths have crossed in different places, and just being able to sit and talk about what's the most important thing in both of our lives, and that's building grassroots Native political power. So Native Organizers Alliance is a national organizing and training network, and we're organized in a very traditional way in concentric circles. And our history is that we were born out of Native community grassroots organizing around the Affordable Care Act. After the Indian Health Improvement Act was rolled into it, our fiscal sponsor, the Alliance for Just Society, hired a number of Indian organizers, some of whom I think you probably know, who worked in Montana and South Dakota and a few places to work in Indian communities. And their conclusion was it was really a gap that we did not have in Indian country, a place where Native tribal leaders, Native community leaders, traditionally could come together and really think through how to draw upon traditional ways of organizing and building community, which we've been doing since Durit, right?
Yep. Right.
But to use those practices as a guide in the 21st century. So that's how it was founded. And we have been running now a training program for over 10 years. Hundreds of people have gone through our trainings. During Standing Rock, we really hit our stride because at any given time, during those many months, there would be between 5, 10, 15 people who've been through our trainings, who were leaders in their communities, had come to Standing Rock with their communities. And so we had kind of an informal political cohort of people who shared similar theory of change. And when we began to build our training program, especially in the last 5 years, we realized that we have such a unique situation in Indian country, that we're the only peoples who have collectively owned land that's been self-governed since the beginning of time. So our experience with democracy and governance is, well, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it is very long, much longer than the existence of the United States. And that we really had to understand that in order for transformational social change to come about, to build a really empowered grassroots native movement, you need every sector to play its role. Our elected tribal leaders, our traditional and spiritual and respected leaders, and the grassroots. And that when these sectors are all walking in the same direction and in the best of days on the same path, then we are very powerful and are able to do things that otherwise we wouldn't. And sometimes we get confused, because sometimes people think grassroots leaders are, there's some kind of hegemony or some kind of hierarchy, or vice versa, that tribal leaders are the ones who should lead and that we should follow. But the truth is, it's that braiding of grassroots understanding and practice and lived experience, and those who choose to run for office and stand in governance of our nations, and the respected traditional spiritual leaders who play a role in our community, and they don't have to be elected. But when there's harmony, we can do great things. I mean, you think about the Menominee tribe, for example, when they regained their tribal sovereignty in the 70s, their federal recognition, um, it was that blending. Some elected, some grassroots, some traditional and respected leaders building that power, pressuring the federal government. And, all through time, there are those kinds of experiences, and many of our origin stories tell that tale. So that's what the Native Organizers Alliance theory of change is. And we are hoping through our work that the kind of relationship building and the support of tribal entities and tribes and Native community groups, urban and res, that we're building up an ecosystem that's rooted in love of our people, that's rooted in reciprocity, that's rooted in discipline and respect, and is rooted in accountability. Because in order to have a militant, empowered Native grassroots movement, we need to love our people and stand with respect and accountability and kinship and reciprocity. So we're building an ecosystem. We're not building a network or an organization, but we work with the groups on the ground who are leading the struggles that build our power on food sovereignty and murdered and missing Indigenous women, on education issues, healthcare issues, on cultural and language protection. So the power comes from the work that goes on every day, but we need to be in an ecosystem so we can learn from one another and we can speak with one voice, one hat.
Well, and I really appreciate that idea is I'm in that vision of an ecosystem, because it says my role, my identity is interconnected to everyone around me, everything around me. And when I see that, I can start to think about how my identity heals historic trauma, how we can move forward with sovereignty, food sovereignty, language sovereignty, other initiatives that are about community and rebuilding community after what we inherited from a violent colonial past, where the same is true in now this political engagement, where we need all of these layers, right? Not everybody's going to vote, right? We understand that in my household, my father, for most of his life, couldn't vote. It was illegal for him to vote. Not until 65, and even then it was a new practice, so he probably didn't vote right away. It wasn't until he actually married my mom that he started voting consistently, right? So it was a new practice in many of our communities where we had to start this engagement from another level, because understanding we're one of the most legislated peoples in the country, our engagement matters. And for a long time, people knew it mattered, so they cut us out of the system. What are you seeing across the country in your role with NOA and others within the political landscape, around the electorate, but just political engagement in general?
Well, I think this political time is, there's never been anything in our lifetimes. There's always been periods of time in history where there's a distinct and clear-cut interruption of culture, of politics, of the way that people live. And oftentimes it's man-made, emphasis on the man, and or natural disasters. And
Yeah.
this is the mother of all interruptions. COVID has interrupted cultural continuity, the economy, the political scene. But what has been born out of this huge interruption is this clear-cut, urgent drive to rebuild, to renew traditional ways of thinking and understandings. And you see that pain and joy can be very braided together in the same moments. So when COVID first hit, I live in New York City in Harlem. It was the most infectious zip code in Manhattan. And we would hear sirens of the ambulances all day long because there wasn't traffic. So you could just hear those ambulances all day long at the peak. But what struck me, not only in New York, but all across the set, there was this initial reaction of understanding that we're all related. We're in relationship to one another, that the healthcare, the health of a healthcare worker is as important as the healthcare of our children. And that I said to myself, well, it's a thin understanding of a basic indigenous framework of being in relationship, all my relations.
Yeah.
But the medicine that especially in a political moment like this that we bring into the social movements is that relationality is so powerful if you're aware of it, because what we do has implications far beyond ourselves, our immediate situation, the immediate place, or this time. And
Mm-hmm.
that the way we walk in the present is how we bring the past and the knowledge and the practices and our ancestors' hopes and our descendants' hopes and what we hope for them. We bring them into the present by how we walk, what
Mm-hmm.
we do, because we have impact. We have, because of our power, unrecognized sometimes, our power of our spirituality, it leads us to build shared power that creates the conditions for emerging power experiments where we try to change the social and economic systemic relationships that have been forced upon us by capitalism. And it gives us the power to challenge the corporations and the rich.
Absolutely. I feel like our indigenous communities, our indigenous Black, brown communities have really been effective at establishing these networks of mutual aid societies. And so far, prior to the pandemic, they were looked at as charity and as, not a means to an end, right? But here they are, the front lines, creating effective, uh, like I said, an effective network of mutual aid organizations and societies that could subvert the the will of the government. And we're seeing the government take sides with capitalism and corporations' needs over the people and our health and our public health and safety. So I'm incredibly proud of our organizers at the front lines, if we will. And I hope that carries on after the pandemic and into this new era in which we're walking into. I'm also just, I know there's such an unknown of what we're walking into, but I'm excited for it. I'm hopeful that the young people and many who are engaging in community now are moving forward and transforming something and creatively reconstructing monuments of truth and power in a new way collectively. And it's a beautiful thing.
Power in a new way, because these mutual aid developments, it's really important for us to understand that the system has failed us.
Mhm.
The problems we're facing now that are being highlighted by COVID, they've been hundreds of years in the making.
Yeah.
And we need to understand the power that we do hold by standing in governance. These mutual aid societies, I'm hopeful that these ecosystems that have sprung up to meet the needs of communities will see themselves and stand in their power of governance. And it will become a model for how it is that we engage our communities in solving problems,
Mhm.
because the solutions come from within. So for example, Corona. Science doesn't know what it doesn't know. They know more about Corona now than they did 5 months ago, but still, science doesn't know what it doesn't know. So where is this power coming from, where we see on Yankton Reservation, for example, Faith Spotted Eagle and the Brave Hat Society, uh, Traditional Women's Society at Yankton, they spurred on a whole movement of over 200 families who, for the first time, plowed gardens together. They rented a backhoe, one for the weekend, and then they went around and they tilled up the land too. And people who would never, despite all the stereotypes, I'm an urban Indian and I walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other, so I'm not a gardener. But there were people who'd never gardened who were gardening and trying to think about the traditional foods and think back to what what they used to eat when they were younger before we could just run off to Walmart. And
Mhm.
because people couldn't run off to Walmart, they were compelled to come together. So standing in governance and figuring out how we can do things means that we can help our tribal governments do the things that they need to and be really in step with what the grassroots is prepared to do on their own behalf.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. For a long time, I put on this hopeful reformer hat that we can change the systems that govern over us, and we can do that without negotiating what we think we have to give up, which is this traditional values and life ways that contribute to community. And I'm like, no, bring that into governance. And the way we do that is elect more leaders from those styles. And that's a harder one to navigate, only because traditionalists and others, cultural knowledge keepers, don't often feel that they can play those roles. We're raising them, though. I see that we're raising this younger generation who will be those candidates, and many others who are stepping in right now across the country. I mean, we have over 130 native candidates across the country running for office. But what your work is, I feel, adds so much value into that idea of self viability. You know, we have to see ourselves not just as candidates, not just changing the system, but those multiple layers that we all have a role to play. That ecosystem means we have the organizers, we have the strategists, we have the voters, we have those who will feed the voters, we have those who are going to be working on the language and other initiatives, and the organizations that you're working with. Uh, what are they, how are they focusing their efforts now? Because it seems like such a battle and a divisive political climate. What's working, what's not working, or what kind of barriers are people running into?
Well, we're working with almost 70 moccasins on the ground in 9 states. 9 states with the native vote is a swing vote, battleground states, as well as states where there are important local races where the Indian vote can make the difference. And in a moment where, many times elections are run by thin margins. For example, Trump won Michigan with the number of votes that we have more Indians on the ground in Michigan than the number of votes that Trump got to win the state of Michigan. So it's razor thin elections because it's a highly polarized electorate and highly polarized political atmosphere. But the thing that I find so interesting, we were on a call today with all of our canvassers and coordinators. I think we are still struggling with how do we portray voting as one tool in the toolbox and not the end. You know, election day, we're not going to know the results of the election. There'll be contested results. All the mail-in ballots won't be counted. It's going to be a hard landing.
Right.
And no matter who gets elected, there are very difficult problems that have been hundreds of years in the making. One vote on election day or early voting is not going to cure COVID.
Right. We're not going to, undo a humanity's worth of oppression to our people and systemic institutionalizing that oppression. We're not going to undo it with one election. So you're right. We need years-long strategies moving forward in engagement.
And really thinking about our role in that way. You know, many of our people, they're from community groups that are doing work on specific issues, food sovereignty, MMIW, and they're building their grassroots power every day in the way that they work. An election period is where you kind of put an exclamation point on that work and say, if you care about federal policy when it comes to murdered and missing Indigenous women, then this is why you vote. If you care about pipelines being built without any prior informed consent by sovereign nations, our sovereign nations, then this is why you should vote, because those decisions are made in DC. But we're finding that it's in this moment of COVID, when people have shown such empathy and solidarity and been out in the streets protesting. We just finished the Indigenous Futures Survey, 6,000 Indians, 400 tribes. It's going to be published next week. But we found that 80% of the people had protested in one way or another since George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police.
Wow, incredible.
And we found that 70% of people live on reservations voted in the last elections, higher in small towns and in the cities, over 80%. So we have a very activated electorate, but many of the people who've been protesting and feeling that surge of struggle against systemic racism, they have a hard time connecting how protest gets into the ballot box. Can you protest into the ballot box? And that's the big question we have to answer, I think, in this election.
Right, that's a hard space to be in. I sit at a few tables where it's the frontline movement, those who've been, putting their lives on the line and trying to draft and negotiate language around implementing, creating policy to implement in our communities that address why we're at the front lines to begin with. And to get into that space is fairly easy, but then we're negotiating. And again, putting on my hopeful reformer hat, saying, well, if there's enough of us getting into the system, we can create and draft meaningful language. And right now in those spaces, they're held by dominant culture organizations who've benefited from, the capitalism, capitalist economies that we're in, benefiting from extractive industry and resources. And in those spaces, there's not enough of our voices moving forward and creating that language that we need, so that those issues are addressed. And that's why I feel like we're raising those folks, and we need enough folks in those spaces that understand that they've been led by dominant culture voices for a very long time, and we're going to be disappointed. But at least our first few times, we're going to be disappointed. And eventually we start moving the dial, we start getting that language in there. And I don't like that incremental practices of change, because we know that doesn't work as well. We need bolder voices and bolder actions, and to do that, we need our frontline folks to see themselves as leaders, not just voters. But if that first step is voting, then vote. Get out there and vote. Just become engaged in the system.
Because the truth is this: if you just vote, it's weak. It's a weak stand. And yes, when millions of vote together, we can either support or reject people who are pursuing policies that are not in the interests of our communities. If you just protest, you're highlighting a problem. Protest is important. Visible displays of resistance, critical. But the truth is, it's not either or, and it shouldn't be. Because, for example, this mass movement, that incredible historic mass movement that exists in our country against systemic racism, 10% of the whole population has marched in the streets. That's over 30 million people. We've never seen that in history, right? While at the same time, people are thinking very broadly and about the nature of the system, capitalist system, and systemic racism, and how they were born out of lands, stealing our land, built on slave labor. And the truth is that many Confederate statues and statues of Columbus were either torn down or they were taken down by decision of governments. So what does that teach us? That the movement played a role of massive movements and actions all over the country, played a role and mobilized grassroots action. It had impact on elected officials in some of those 130 cities that celebrate Indigenous Peoples' Day instead of Columbus Day. Those elected officials in some places said, let's get rid of these Columbus statues.
Yep.
And so because of the movement. Or you look at the dropping of the racist NFL DC name of the team, right?
Right.
3 years of organizing, high points and low points. And the truth is that there were some high points, like in the 90s, when some high schools, some colleges got rid of their racist mascots. But it was a moment where systemic racism was being struggled against openly for days and days and weeks in the streets, that built the pressure to achieve what a movement for over 30 years had been highlighting and trying to interrupt the narrative on. And so that last drop in the bucket was a massive upsurge in response to George Floyd being murdered. So we have to see that there are people in elected office who become motivated to do the best things for our communities because of what's going on in the streets. And there are people in the streets who have to say, well, I'm going to run for office. I'm going to be the campaign manager. And, I think that relationship between elected officials and movements is a very tender ecosystem too, really.
Really is.
Flanagan, the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, one of the founders of Advanced Native Political Leadership, one of your co-workers, said on a panel this week we were on together, she said, we need not only more people to run, but we need campaign managers. We need data specialists. We need communication directors, chiefs of staff. We've got to be in all kinds of positions in order to leverage that grassroots protest in the streets.
I agree. And as soon as you were saying about the elected leaders are making decisions because this is what the people want, I thought about your language around the ecosystem and the environment. And when I first started organizing over 20 years ago, we kind of had 3 questions around the different campaigns that we were pushing forward. What do we want? Who makes the decisions, and how do we affect those decisions? And how do we affect those decisions is really around that ecosystem, creating enough public pressure for elected leaders to say, okay, it's safe for me to make this decision. Where in many places, and where I am in North Dakota, there's not that support because the public pressure says, no, do what we've always done because that's the way we've always done it, right? And so when we march in the streets and gather to change a name, because there's a lot of names, parks, streets, monuments to, heroes that are their legitimacy is because of genocide. Because they killed indigenous people, right? We cannot have those monuments anymore. But we don't have that same political ecosystem climate for them to make those decisions. And my response to that was like, organizers, you've been organizing for several years now. It's time for you to run for office. Like, run for that park board, run for the city commission, run for mayor. Like, you can absolutely do this. Wow, our time is going by really fast, Judith. I want to ask you some questions around the presidential debates. We've had a couple of them now. I appreciated the last format last night versus the previous format where the candidates were squaring off with one another in a way that didn't reach the public very well. But what are your reactions to the presidential debates? Not necessarily shooting for one candidate over the other, but is there something that in a world that really reflected the demographics of community and Indian country, what would presidential candidates be speaking to for Indian country if that was the forefront of the world we want to see?
So we joined with Four Directions, another Indian group that's for over a decade has been doing voter engagement work and has spearheaded some of the most important legal fights with the Native American Rights Fund to protect the right and expand the right to vote in Indian country. We joined together last year to do the first ever Native Presidential Candidates Forum. And we had over 500 people. We mobilized from the 7 states where we're a swing vote. We had elected officials, traditional leaders, grassroots community leaders, questioning and schooling 11 presidential candidates, 11 top tier presidential candidates. And we had live coverage from MSNBC and CNN and New York Times, on and on and on. We interrupted the narrative. And the reason why is because we did the math for the candidates. 7 states, Indians, swing vote, 77 electoral votes will be decided in those 7 states. But the thing that struck me is that they really had never had the opportunity to speak to over 500 Indians and to speak and respond to 7 elected or tribal leaders, traditional leaders, youth leaders directly. The first time ever, the Indian country put that opportunity before presidential candidates. And one of the young people, Cedar Fernandez from Menominee, said in a panel discussion earlier this week that she's going to be a first-time voter in this election. But when she went to that forum, and we brought over 60 organizers to actually staff the forum, everything from the green room to the press room to tickets, giving out tickets to get in and security. And she said the thing that changed her mind about voting was to actually see these candidates, Elizabeth Warren, everybody, Bernie, to see them as humans and what they are actually like. And I thought to myself, that's such an interesting perception that she came to terms with the fact that it's about people and it's about power, because voting is an act of power.
Yes.
This system banks on us not voting.
Right.
So for example, we have people working on the ground in the Cherokee Res in North Carolina, and they've been hit pretty hard with COVID, and it's mainly women. There's 11 canvassers, and they're kicking butt and taking names there from all day until sundown. And the thing that hit me about the work that they're doing is that they see it as part of the long arc of justice, going back all the way to Jackson. That we, Native peoples, have been a part of this country since its very beginning. We've had influence on politics, but until that presidential candidates forum, there had never been a presidential candidates forum where the candidates of the major parties felt compelled to even meet with us.
Yeah.
And so I'm feeling very optimistic that whoever gets elected, we're going to have a fight, because we're going to have to repair the damage of COVID. We're going to have to repair the damage that has been done in these last several months. The high unemployment rate, people being evicted from their homes, people homeless, Indians homeless in the city of Minneapolis. It's an epidemic right now, and it's just getting cold. So no matter what, after the elections are over, we are going to have to fight even harder, because the elections are not going to solve COVID or the systemic racism or unemployment or on and on and on. So I'm hoping that whoever wins, that we're going to have a movement strong and powerful enough that get what we need to protect our people from COVID. Number two, that we will stop the pipelines that are being built and reverse direction to develop sustainable regenerative energy sources. And number three, that we'll be able to fight and build a movement that can compel the federal government to ensure that we're able to protect our sacred places. So those are the three issues. Who's ever president, we're going to wage huge fight. We're going to continue the movement building we've been doing as we're building voter engagement in Indian country.
Absolutely. I feel like our values and our means of governance, they influence the form of government that we have now, but they left out certain things that allowed for balance and parity and um, leadership roles that created this white hetero patriarchy that we see today, and it still unfolds, and something that we continue to deconstruct, and it will take years. We're getting close to our time, Judith. I'm so thankful that you were able to join us. And as we move forward over the next few weeks, there's still a lot of voters who are heading to the polls November 3rd, or early voting, voting by mail, or voting early where their precincts allow. But what do you want voters to know in this election?
Number one, please go to the website natives, plural, nativesvote2020.com. On that website, you can get every single legal detail for your state on how to vote, how to register, early voting, what are the laws regulating that. And you should know that it is part of the Voting Rights Act that if you need someone to help you, if you decide not to mail in and you decide to mask up and go to vote, you can have someone help you in the voting booth. And many of our elders, they want to vote. They don't trust the system. Why should they? You
Yes.
know, there's no reason to trust the system. So that is something you need to know, that if anyone needs help in voting, that they have a federal right to help people in the voting booth. The last thing is that we really, really, really are urging that people make a plan and either mask up and vote early or on election day, or mail in or mask up. And staying healthy and protecting our children and our elders is the most important thing. But we are, and we will continue to in these 9 states. And we encourage everybody else to find safe ways to help people register and vote. So for example, I will end with this: take from Urban Indian some good advice. Get a shower curtain, tape it in between the front seat and the back seat. Make sure everybody has masks and hand sanitizers, and you can still take people to vote safely. That's what the cabs do here in New York City. And we've got to find all of these creative ways to make sure that people have the right to vote. If it's early voting, long lines, 13 million have voted already, but there's been long lines in a number of states. Organize young people to stand in line for the elder or the person who's not feeling well so they can sit in their cars and still have the right to vote if there's a long line. So we've got to use our grassroots native creative ingenuity. Lastly, there's so many materials on nativesvote2020.com that you can download pieces, memes, materials, as well as the legal information.
Yes, absolutely. Get involved. Go to the website. And I like the shower curtain idea because I know we have a lot of elders who want to vote in person. And if that's the case, as Judith said, we got to mask up and encourage people to do so safely, voting safely. I also want to do one more thing too, where with you mentioned the Native American Rights Fund, they have the 1-866-OUR-VOTE. If you see any activities that are out there that are actively suppressing voters or intimidating voters, give our friends over at Native American Rights Fund a call, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, OURVOTE, and we got to stop these practices that are impeding our right to vote and engage in our democracies. Thank you, Judith. We really appreciate your time on this evening, this Friday night, where you could be out and about, but because of the pandemic, we're thankful that you stayed home for us, and we hope you vote safely as well. Thanks everybody for tuning in. The sun is going down over here on my end, and we'll see you next time.